They had one card left, the card that kept every enemy at the table, every threat half-hearted, every negotiation tilted in their favor for 45 years. And in the span of 14 days, they handed it over. Not because of bombs, not because of soldiers, because of a strait 21 miles wide and a clock that was running out. If you've been trying to understand what just happened in Iran, stay with this until the end, because the headline you read does not come close to capturing what is actually unfolding right now inside the regime that just made the most consequential concession in the modern history of the Middle East. Here is what most people do not know. Iran's enriched uranium was never just a weapons program. It was the reason the Islamic Republic commanded fear, the reason Washington paused, the reason Tel Aviv kept its strike aircraft on standby for 3 decades. By June 2025, Iran had accumulated over 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, enough fissile material properly processed for more than 10 nuclear warheads. The window of time experts call breakout time, the gap between a political decision to build a bomb and the actual technical capacity to detonate one, had collapsed to something approaching zero. For Israel, that was not a policy concern. It was an existential countdown with a visible clock face. For Saudi Arabia, it meant the permanent end of whatever strategic balance the Gulf had managed to preserve. For the United States, a nuclear-armed Iran in a region where Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey had each privately communicated they would pursue their own programs in response, meant the beginning of the most catastrophic proliferation cascade in the history of the nuclear age. There is a reason we cover this every day and not once a week, because the decisions being made inside Tehran right now are moving faster than most news cycles can track. If this kind of analysis matters to you, hit like so this reaches people who need to understand what is actually happening. Now, here is the part of this story that almost no one is explaining correctly. The uranium was distributed across 3 underground fortresses, specifically engineered to survive American and Israeli airstrikes. Natanz, buried inside mountains behind concrete and lead shielding. Isfahan, holding roughly half the total stockpile in tunnels more than 90 meters deep. Fordo, constructed entirely inside a mountain, built to resist direct impact from the most powerful conventional munitions in the American arsenal. The June 2025 strikes did severe damage to all 3 facilities. Significant portions of the stockpile were buried under rubble. But here is what those strikes fundamentally could not solve. Uranium enriched to 60% does not decay. It does not degrade. It does not become strategically irrelevant. It can remain at weapons-relevant enrichment levels for hundreds of years. The bombs destroyed the infrastructure. They did not destroy the material. And material, given time and resources, can be reconstructed. The program could be rebuilt. This is precisely what drove the Pentagon to present Trump with a ground operation plan that senior defense officials described in unambiguous terms as a logistics nightmare more complex than Normandy. The 82nd Airborne would paradrop into hostile territory and construct a runway from scratch under enemy fire. Delta Force and Navy SEAL teams would blast through 300 feet of rubble to reach tunnels 90 meters underground. Operators in hazmat suits would advance step by step through environments where a single mistake meant radiation contamination. All of it sustained under continuous Iranian missile and drone attack for weeks. Only a few dozen soldiers in the entire United States military have received training in nuclear material recovery operations. The plan was possible on paper. In practice, former defense officials said it was something they could not recommend executing. Trump looked at that plan, then looked at a 21-mile-wide strait, and chose the strait. On April 13th, the United States Navy declared a full blockade of Iranian ports at the Strait of Hormuz. Shadow fleet vessels, ships that had been moving Iranian oil through back channels for years, turned back. 97% of Iran's oil had been flowing to China before the blockade. American destroyers redirected Chinese-linked tankers. The surveillance architecture was total. The enforcement was complete. But the blockade did not only stop oil. The bulk of Iran's food imports moved by sea. Wheat, rice, cooking oil, pharmaceutical materials, industrial spare parts. All of it transited through Hormuz. The blockade sealed both ends of Iran's economic circulatory system simultaneously. Nothing went out, nothing came in. And in Tehran's highest decision-making rooms, the people who understood the numbers did the mathematics the blockade forced them to do. Within 10 days, oil wells would begin shutting down from storage overflow. Once shut, some would never fully recover. Within 10 days, food stock buffers in major cities would begin running visibly thin. Within 10 days, industrial facilities dependent on imported raw materials would start going dark. Within 10 days, the money sustaining every function of the Iranian state, soldier salaries, proxy network financing, the government subsidies maintaining the last threads of the social contract with the Iranian people, would be effectively zero. And here is the question the Hormuz blockade forced Tehran to confront at a speed that no previous sanction regime ever had. Uranium enriched to 60% is a powerful bargaining chip, a decades-long investment in deterrence and regional psychology. But what does a regime do with enriched uranium when its economy has already collapsed? What does the IRGC protect with its sacred stockpile when the regime itself is 2 weeks from structural failure? Hormuz answered the question. Uranium is leverage. Hormuz is survival. And when those two things come into direct conflict, only one of them determines whether the regime exists next month. Iran came to the table and it brought the uranium. But here is the layer of this story that the headline you read this morning does not capture, and it is more dangerous than the agreement itself. Iran is not a unified state governed from a single center of authority. It never has been, and right now it is more fractured than at any point in its post-revolutionary history. On one side stands President Masoud Pezeshkian. He wanted a ceasefire before the conflict reached its current intensity. He has been publicly warning, in language extraordinary for a sitting Iranian president, that the economy will completely collapse within 3 weeks. He represents the faction that understands with cold clarity that the regime cannot survive the economic trajectory the IRGC's war strategy has produced. His position on the uranium is pragmatic in the most brutal possible sense. Hand it over, lift the blockade, keep the regime standing. Institutional humiliation, yes. Retreat from 45 years of declared principle, yes. But a humiliated regime still exists. A regime economically annihilated in the next 14 days does not. On the other side stands IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi. And what Vahidi has been doing while negotiations proceeded is not passive objection. It is active seizure of state functions, blocking presidential appointments, filling intelligence ministry positions himself outside the constitutional process that requires presidential authority, pressuring the Supreme National Security Council to be restructured in the IRGC's favor. Pezeshkian formally demanded that executive powers be returned to the civilian government. Vahidi refused. This is not a policy disagreement between two branches of the same government. This is a constitutional coup being executed in slow motion inside a regime that is simultaneously negotiating with Washington, managing popular uprisings across dozens of cities, sustaining military operations with soldiers who are deserting in groups, and trying to prevent an economic collapse that is now 2 weeks away. And above both of them, providing neither clarity nor resolution, is the supreme leader, constitutionally the commander-in-chief of all Iranian armed forces, almost never seen in public, functionally absent from the decision-making the crisis demands. The legitimacy vacuum created by a supreme leader who cannot function is the single most important enabler of what Vahidi is doing. Every decision requires authorization that cannot be obtained, which means the entity willing to act without authorization wins. The IRGC is willing to act without authorization. That is the entire mechanism of the power seizure. Now ask the question every intelligence service watching Tehran is asking right now. Can the IRGC sabotage the uranium handover? The technical answer is yes. It could obstruct the physical handover process, block facility access, create bureaucratic friction that extends the timeline indefinitely while publicly claiming good faith compliance. It could move stockpiles to locations the IAEA has never officially been told about. The agency has consistently documented that Iran's declared nuclear activities do not account for all of Iran's nuclear activities. It could underreport, declare a portion of the stockpile surrendered while retaining a concealed reserve that quietly preserves the technical option it is publicly abandoning. These options exist. Whether they can be executed depends entirely on one specific calculation. Does the IRGC believe it can survive what happens if Trump concludes Iran is not complying? Because that is a specific and dangerous thing to do to a specific and dangerous man, with 3 carrier strike groups and a ground operation plan already drawn up and sitting on a shelf. The IRGC faces 3 options: accept the handover, institutional suicide for an organization whose entire identity was built around protecting that stockpile, but a surviving regime is a platform from which power can eventually be rebuilt. Sabotage and continue the war, which invites Trump to execute every card simultaneously. Intensified blockade, ended ceasefire, ground operation moving from a plan on a shelf to an order in execution. Or internal coup, topple Pezeshkian's government, declare military rule, end the diplomatic process entirely, and hand the whole Iranian state to the organization whose strategy produced the current catastrophe. As one analyst described it, that would be hammering the final nail into an already collapsing structure. Every option means loss. The calculation being made right now in Tehran is which loss is most survivable. The regional implications are already reshaping the Middle East's strategic architecture before the ink on any agreement has dried. For Israel, the Iranian concession removes the single threat that has dominated its national security planning for 2 decades. Within hours of Trump's announcement, Netanyahu signaled readiness to engage in Lebanon's ceasefire talks. The timing was not coincidental. With the nuclear shadow removed, the calculus of every other regional negotiation changes. Hezbollah without Iranian nuclear backing is a different organization than Hezbollah with it. The psychological architecture of Iran's entire proxy network was partly built around the implied protection of the nuclear deterrent behind it. Remove the deterrent, and every proxy recalculates its risk exposure. For Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, the relief is existential, but immediately complicated by what comes next. The nightmare scenario: a nuclear-armed Iran triggering a regional proliferation cascade has been avoided, at least for now, at least from this cause. But the Gulf states are not simply exhaling and returning to previous positions. They are moving actively because the lesson of the past months is not only that Iran's nuclear program is gone. The lesson is that Iran's entire strategic architecture, the Hormuz control doctrine, the proxy network, the deterrence through nuclear ambiguity, has been exposed as more fragile than anyone believed. And fragility, once revealed, invites permanent response. The most consequential long-term development emerging from this crisis is not the uranium handover itself. It is what the Gulf states are doing about Hormuz. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have concluded that Iran's capacity to threaten that strait must be permanently eliminated. Not deterred, not managed, but architecturally removed by building around the geography that made the threat possible. Massive bypass pipelines and canal projects are now underway across the Arabian Peninsula. Routes designed to move Gulf oil to global markets without ever transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The investment is measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The strategic logic driving it is not primarily economic. It is geopolitical. When Gulf oil can reach global markets without touching Hormuz, the Islamic Republic's ultimate card is not blocked. It is canceled permanently, without a military operation, without any Iranian agreement, without negotiation. The geography itself is being re-engineered to make the threat impossible rather than simply contained. This is historically unusual thinking, not fighting over terrain, but eliminating the terrain's strategic value by building around it. Iran's ultimate card will be canceled not by American warships maintaining a blockade indefinitely, but by construction equipment moving through Arabian desert while the world watches the diplomacy. That quiet engineering is more permanent than anything being announced at any press conference. But between Trump's announcement and that permanent future lies the most dangerous window of this entire crisis. The hours and days immediately following a forced public capitulation by an organization like the IRGC are not hours of stability. They are the hours when the internal calculation of men like Vahidi reaches its most acute and most unpredictable point. The IRGC's entire institutional narrative, the story it tells itself, the Iranian people, and its proxy partners about why it exists and why it demands the budgets and authority and privileges that it does, rests on the claim of unbreakable resistance. That claim just broke, publicly, announced by the American president, attributed to Iranian acceptance, broadcast to every government and every population and every proxy organization that has been told for 45 years that the uranium was the red line that would never be crossed. Hezbollah is running the math. The Houthis are running the math. Iraqi militias are running the math. If Iran surrendered its nuclear card under 14 days of economic pressure, what does that tell us about the protection we were promised? If the IRGC's most sacred commitment could be reversed that fast, what is the IRGC's commitment to our security actually worth? Those questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. The proxy network was sustained for decades by the perception of Iranian power and reliability. Perception once shattered does not reassemble around a press release. It requires years of demonstrated capacity to rebuild. Iran does not have years. It barely has weeks before the economic consequences of the current trajectory become structurally irreversible. And the Iranian people, the ones state television assured the world had 87% war support in a poll from a source that was never named, are standing in fuel lines in an oil-producing country, watching the regime that told them their sacrifices were necessary for regional dominance formally surrender the centerpiece of that dominance to the country it has called the Great Satan since 1979. The 2009 Green Movement erupted from a stolen election. The 2019 uprising erupted from a gasoline price increase. The 2022 wave erupted from a young woman dying in police custody. Each was triggered by a single visible injustice that crystallized accumulated grievance into organized protest. The current conditions are heavier than all three of those moments combined. Economic collapse, military defeat, and diplomatic surrender are happening simultaneously. The trigger that ignites the next wave does not need to be dramatic. The kindling is already everywhere. Here is where the picture stands. Trump announced that Iran has agreed to surrender its nuclear stockpile. Iran has not officially confirmed this. Between the announcement and the confirmation lies a gap in which the IRGC's decision, accept institutional humiliation or escalate toward regime destruction, is still being made. Vahidi is seizing state functions. Pezeshkian is demanding them back. The ceasefire deadline has passed. The blockade holds. The storage tanks are filling. The oil wells are approaching the point of shutdown from which some will not recover. The soldiers are deserting. The proxy networks are asking whether dying for Tehran still makes strategic sense. The Gulf states are building pipelines that will make Hormuz irrelevant before the decade ends. And somewhere in the underground facilities, buried under rubble, the uranium that the IRGC called its national pride and its resistance shield and its reason for existence is sitting in conditions no inspector has yet accessed and no satellite can fully verify. The United States achieved something its own defense officials called nearly impossible. It convinced Iran to surrender its most strategic asset without executing the most complex military operation since Normandy. It did not send the 82nd Airborne. It did not deploy Delta Force into 90-meter tunnels in hazmat suits. It closed the strait, turned time against a regime that was already cracking from within, and waited at a table until the mathematics of survival overrode 45 years of ideological commitment. It worked, at least on paper, at least according to one announcement, at least for now. But the IRGC's silence since that announcement is not necessarily acceptance. It may be the calm before the most consequential decision the organization has ever faced. Because surrendering the uranium means surrendering the narrative. And the narrative, right now, is the last thing the IRGC still fully controls. Something seismic just happened in the Middle East. The most seismic part is not the concession itself. It is what comes next inside the regime that was forced to make it. That answer is still being decided in Tehran, in tunnels, in rooms, among men who have been fighting each other since 1988, choosing between survival and the story they have told themselves their entire lives. We break down exactly what the world's power structures are actually doing, not what they're saying, every single day. If you haven't already, subscribing takes 2 seconds and make sure you don't miss what comes next. Because what comes next in Iran may be the most important thing you watch this year. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Does the IRGC accept the humiliation, or do they gamble everything on escalation? The people watching this have some of the sharpest takes I've seen anywhere. Let's see what you think is actually coming.